Bonsoir à tout le monde et merci
Good
beaucoup,
evening, everyone, and thank you, Laurence, for the introduction. I will be very short in my introduction because we want to leave as much time as possible for David to talk to us, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. What we really want to show here, many of you know his work, but it goes beyond what he has done for television, and there's a coherence, an extraordinary coherence.
David, the goal of this masterclass is to, in my opinion, to show that your work has sort of a coherence in itself for about 20, 25 years now. We hear about this, the reason why you're in Paris is this book that's been published now in French about 20 years after it was published in the States. It's a book about 1 year when you followed cops in Baltimore, and you were a young journalist at the time, and this book doesn't look like a journalist's work from what we imagine it should be. It's more rooted in, it has a literary ambition to it, and it's rooted in new journalism and things like that. How did you end up making that book? What's your life story before that book that,
Well, everything in the book is true, and it's the real names, the detectives, and it was the casework that happened in 1988. I was 27 when I went into the homicide unit in Baltimore. I guess I weighed about 35 pounds less. I had hair, It does feel like a long time ago. But I don't think it was that much a leap from the work of a lot of other journalists. Narrative journalism had started to take hold in the imagination of a lot of reporters in America at that time. There had been at least a decade of writing by various people in which they would do immersion journalism, where they would sort of hang out somewhere for a period of time and then be able to write sort of an interior dialectic of that process or that place. And there were books that I admired by people. But I was relatively young to try it, but I have to say I grew up in a household with a family that exposed me to journalism, to newspapers, to magazines, to political argument, to political discourse, debate. Arguing was a sport in my family. We went to the dinner table, and you were assessed on how well you could debate, on your rhetoric. It was not a belligerent argument. It often got quite loud, but it was not. Nothing was held. There were no grudges that lasted past the argument that I remember. And we were assessed in that way. It was how you impressed the older siblings. It was how you impressed your parents. So the first thing you did in the morning was you read the newspaper aggressively. And I remember that being sort of my way of being from the time I was maybe 9 or 10. I was reading stuff and not understanding it, but I just wanted to kick in something at the dinner table. And so I got to reading a lot of journalists a lot earlier than I think a lot of kids do or maybe ought. It certainly damaged me. All I wanted to do was be a newspaperman from a too early age. And so I was already acquiring guys who had storytelling acumen beyond sort of rote journalism. My dad was turning me on to guys like Swope, Henry Swope, or Mencken, H.O. Mencken, who later was at my paper, or earlier was at my paper at the Sun, or Damon Runyon or Tom Wolfe later on with the new journalism. Especially after I got to high school and I was interested, he could see that I was interested in newspapering, and I was working on my school paper. So that was when I was reading these guys. So I had seen some of those kinds of books.
Did you read? I think you lived in Washington, in D.C.
Right over the line.
Yeah. And you went. It was the Watergate story broke when you were reading the newspaper, right? Washington Post.
I was about 12 and a half when the stories started coming in my hometown paper. The Washington Post was one of the papers we took at home every day. So I was from we weren't ideological, but we were more left than right, Democratic, New Deal family. So we weren't exactly fans of Richard Nixon. And as he started getting in trouble in the Watergate scandal and as his presidency was threatened, it was kind of like an adventure. It was like a scavenger hunt. And every day you would pick up the paper and see if they had gotten any closer, what was happening now. And following the investigation in real time was very exciting to me. It was these two guys, these two Metro reporters from my hometown paper were getting closer and closer to ending a very corrupt presidency. And that was startling to me. And I just remember reading this. In fact, I remember I had to go to summer camp. They sent me away to summer camp in the middle of '74, in the summer of '74, and that was when Nixon resigned. So, like the end of it, as the thing started, once they got into the hearings and Nixon was only weeks away from having his presidency ended, I was stuck. I couldn't read the paper anymore. It was the worst part of summer camp. I had to just go like other kids and, do other summer camp crap. And nobody had a good newspaper. So.
And then some 15 years later, so you spent a year with that, in the police department in Baltimore. What was the appeal of that, and what was your process?
I'd been a police reporter at The Sun for 4 years, and 2 of those were spent on the night cops beat, where I would come in at 4 in the afternoon, and I would stay till the morning paper shut down at about 1 a.m. And if something was breaking, I had to stay till 2 a.m. to continue to cover it, if something big was happening. Excusez-moi. But you can imagine that was very reactive. Every day, something happened. Somebody got shot, 2-car fatal, 3-alarm row house fire. Somebody died, somebody didn't die, somebody almost died. But it would be what happened yesterday, and it would be entirely reactive. And so after a while, after a couple years of doing that, I learned the city. Obviously, I was spelling the street names right, and I was learning how the city worked a bit. But it's pretty dry after a while, doing the same thing over and over again. It becomes bloodless in a way. You don't feel those people. You don't feel the tragedy anymore because there's sort of a rote formula to that kind of coverage. There's nothing inaccurate about it, but you start to feel that there's sort of some actual human tragedy that you're not getting to, some sense of the stakes involved are not really appearing anymore in your coverage. And I'd gotten used to dealing with the homicide unit because, Baltimore is a city, to give you some context, Baltimore is about 1/10 the size of Paris, and we have twice the number of your murders in that town in the average year. So it's a rather violent place, and I would say 2 murders every 3 days. That's what the workload was. So these guys in this unit were like an assembly line of death investigation. They got, a week, 2 weeks to work a case, and then a fresh murder would come, and they'd have to pick up the fresh case as well. And so they tried to work back on cases, but obviously it was a little bit of triage. And I thought to myself, if I could get into that unit, maybe there's a different way of slicing the cake, and somehow introducing some human element. If I could tell their stories and what it was like to work murders when murders were no longer extraordinary, but in fact ordinary occurrences, maybe there's a way to address the level of violence in my city in a fresh way.
So you basically spent 12 or 15-hour days following the cops and taking notes and behind doors or with them.
I was really fortunate in that my first marriage, which was kind of a 2 years, no kids, I'm in my 20s, it broke up in December of '87. So I was I was in a row house in Baltimore without furniture because, the wife got the furniture. And I was driving the shitty car because she got the good car. And basically I was sans life. And it was a perfect time to sort of lose yourself in this police unit they put me on one shift, so it was 19 guys. And by guys, I say guys, there were no female detectives on that shift at that time. And they put me in the unit, and there basically were only a few rules, which were very basic, and they made sense. They weren't trying to inhibit what I saw in any real way. And they let me stay there for a year. Why they let me in is sort of amazing unto itself. The police commissioner, I wrote him a letter, And he said yes. And I've never really been able to confirm what I'd heard about why he let me into the unit, because he died before the book came out. I heard from other people, from other commanders, that he explained himself, his decision, by saying when he was a homicide detective in his career, it was the most meaningful couple of years of his police career. So I like to think that his reasons for letting me in were very, very pure, and that he just wanted to read the story, see if it could be done. But in the pitch-perfect black humor of the detectives, once he passed away, the sarcasm was that, of course, he let you in. It was a terrible decision. He did it because he had a brain tumor, because he had died of a brain tumor. So that was what they said of Ed Tillman's decision to let me in the homicide unit. I paid him back with a little bit of homage. For those of you that watched The Wire, the middle school where the kids went to school in season 4 was named Ed Tillman Middle School in Baltimore, and that was me saying thank you to this man. I never got to thank him or even talk to him about his decision, because he was gone long before the book was finished.
Anyone who's seen your shows and read that book, we just see that how much you've learned from this year, and how much everything that you wrote afterwards was sort of influenced by that book, I would say. But there's one case in the book that I think is more interesting than the others in that matter. It's the LaTonya Wallace case of that young girl who was raped and murdered. And I'm sorry to spoil the audience, but it's sort of the whole point of it. There is no resolution in the end. And I think when I read that, I just realized maybe this was a turning point for you in terms of what is drama, what is the relationship between real life and drama, because in real life closure isn't always there, and that's something that's in all your shows.
In drama, it's often there because it's written to be there. Yeah, that's true. I mean, LaTonya Wallace was this young girl, a 12-year-old girl who was found raped and murdered in February of the year I was there, and the detectives on the shift I were on worked it pretty consistently until December, where they took maybe their last and best shot at their main suspect in an interrogation room, and the interrogation lasted about 14 hours. And in the end, the case was never solved. It actually was investigated beyond my year, but I saw them get as close as they ever got to an arrest. And at first, it's embarrassing to say, because obviously the real stakes here are a 12-year-old girl was raped and murdered, and they didn't avenge the killing. And that's how it felt to detectives. But I have to admit to a journalist's, what's the word I'm looking for, when self-absorption, that when you're devoting this much time to a story, you're thinking to yourself, I remember as I watched the suspect walk to the elevators without being charged, I remember thinking to myself, my God, I have a book and I don't have an ending. And, forgive that for the, sort of the human disconnect there. But I'd spent a year with these guys, and I was a very worried 28-year-old kid who had taken money to, taken an advance and lived on an advance for a year to write a book, and now, what was I writing? And I had all the absurd expectations that entertainment gives you, like crime fiction or cop shows or all the stuff. Even though I'd covered the real thing, in your own screwed up way, you're thinking, man, they had to solve this murder. This murder is so important. How could they not solve it? They always solve this stuff before the last commercial break. And it took a couple of days of sort of regrouping before I connected with exactly what you were saying. The idea that, I just witnessed a year in which the clearance rate was about 70%. 30% of the murders, they didn't even charge anybody. And by the time it went through court, the number of people who actually got punished, who actually got any jail time, was about 45%. So this was kind of the way of the world. And even though it was an innocent girl, and even it was the murder that everybody in that unit, not just the idiot reporter, but everybody wanted to solve, that guaranteed nothing. And so it took my editor, John Sterling, on the book to say, maybe you got the ending you need. And maybe that's the book. Maybe, reconnect with the truth here, and not your own expectation. And that was the beginning of me seeing the actual emotional spine and resonance of the book.
The book was later the inspiration for a TV show that was created by Tom Fontana and Bear Levinson. We're going to see a clip from that show and discuss that after.
Oh, Jack's the second house in. Doors probably reinforced, so we'll use them all from the get-go.
Okay. All right, let's do it.
Hey, wait. Remember, I go in first. You're just along for the ride.
You're the man, ma'am.
Watching TV, huh?
Yeah, I'm watching Mighty Mouse.
Oh, Mighty Mouse.
Yeah. Well, you want to watch something else?
Well, there's a retrospective on Frederick Wiseman on cable.
Nobody moves! Nobody moves!
Showing Titicut Follies. It's a seminal work he did on an insane asylum in Massachusetts. It's genius.
Give me my lawyer now! Get off of me! You understand me? Let go! Stupid ass!
He doesn't even put film in his camera for the first few weeks of work. Only when his subjects forget that the camera's there does he begin to really capture reality.
He doesn't put film in his camera.
That's brilliant when you think about it.
Mighty Mouse.
Okay, fine.
So in case people didn't notice, that's an episode that you wrote, and yeah, where I'm getting into. It's Frederick Wiseman, that name. I think it's a great inspiration of your work, and I was happy to find this clip because it sort of is the proof of that.
You really were digging, weren't you? Wow. Yeah, I was throwing out some homage to the documentary filmmaker, Frederick Wiseman. And that's stuff about him not putting film in the camera for the first couple of months or however long until the subjects get used to the camera being there, and then that's when he starts filming, so as to to have a more authentic version of reality. Mm-hmm. And Wiseman was somebody who I wasn't a cinemaphile at all. I just watched films the way normal people go to the theater and like stuff and don't like stuff. But Wiseman, because he was doing immersion documentary in the same way that I was starting to get interested and had been, obviously Homicide was the result of immersion journalism, of me showing up in this police unit and trying to get them to just be and not pay attention to me in any real way, in any important way. I was throwing out some homage there. I'd forgotten all about that. That's pretty funny that you dug that up. Yeah. I got to watch you. Apparently you're more dangerous than I thought.
It's like there's the part of the scene is like a typical cop show, and the other is what cop shows should look into.
Right. It's intercut with something that is, and with a shaky camera and that sort of Godard thing that Levinson was playing with in the style of the show and the triple cuts and everything. It was a little bit meta. We were making fun of our own place in the media world making this television show. So we had a little bit of fun with ourselves.
So just to be clear, this show wasn't your show. And
no, I learned to produce TV on this show because my book was bought. The book, Homicide, was bought, and it became this show. And I went back to being a newspaper reporter. And so this was a strange stepchild of my book that was filming in Baltimore while I was continuing to be a journalist. And at some point, long story short, my newspaper started going bad. The bad things that began happening to American journalism, American newspapering in the 90s started at the Baltimore Sun, and they would continue to this day. And so the Sun was trying to reduce its staff in order to make itself more profitable. They figured out that, Wall Street figured out that if they told the newspaper chains, if you put out a shittier paper, you'll make more money. And that's exactly right. They did make more money. So they offered buyouts to about 150 employees. And you got a year's salary if you were ready to leave. And I'd written a couple of scripts earlier for the show, sort of almost as a lark, not really seriously contemplating it other than an interesting exercise. And they offered me a job at about the same time the Sun was offering me a salary to leave. So I went there, but I still thought I was going to go back to another newspaper. I wasn't, but I ended up writing for this show and knowing nothing about film at all, being hilariously inattentive to how films were made. I just knew that I liked watching them now and then. And Tom and the other people involved with Homicide slowly started teaching me how to be a dramatist. And so the template of Homicide, the television show, belongs to Barry Levinson, the director, and Tom Fontana, the writer. And I was kind of like a carpenter nailing boards in on their blueprint, helping them build their house. Not that I'm ashamed, it was I think, a really worthy drama, and I learned an incredible amount, and I was very proud to do it in the end, but it's not mine, and I wouldn't claim it.
How did you become a television writer? I mean, you were on staff on Homicide, but you were still thinking about going back to journalism, and then you made that show for HBO called The Corner miniseries.
Right. I left journalism not so much through a decision, but through the absence of a decision. And what happened was, I always thought I would work for a couple seasons on Homicide because when I left the Sun, I was trying to finish my second book, which was also immersion journalism. It was about a year in the life of a drug corner in a drug-saturated neighborhood, about the people, not about the police, but about the people being policed in the middle of the American drug prohibition. And that book took as long or even longer to research while I followed the characters and while I finished the manuscript. So when I left the Sun, I still had maybe 10 months of writing left. And you can't go to, I'd always thought I would go to a better newspaper. Maybe I had a standing offer to go to work at the Washington Post, which was a newspaper that was still doing the kind of work that I most admired in journalism. And I thought, I'll go there. But first, I'll finish the manuscript because you don't want to go to a new paper because you're supposed to, you take a new job, you ought to kick ass for a couple of years. So I better have the manuscript done so I'm not, my time isn't divided. And what better thing to do while you're finishing the book is I'll write a few scripts, I'll become a story editor on Homicide, they'll pay me a salary, I won't, So I took the job. But I always thought when Homicide ended, or even before, I would leave and go back to journalism once I got the book done. Then when I finally got the book done, the same Tom Fontana who was making Homicide and who was mentoring me in television, he sold something called Oz to this new channel. It wasn't a new channel, but they were just new at doing drama called HBO. And for those of you who haven't seen Oz, it was a very dark show about a tier of a maximum security prison. Really dark. It made the Corner look like a romp in the park. So he showed us the first, he made like a 20-minute mini pilot, and I remember watching it in the offices of Homicide and thinking, they're going to put this on TV, on American TV? Who are these guys? And up until that moment, I thought my second book has no chance of being made into any part of television. But after seeing Oz, I thought, well, maybe I need a meeting. Maybe I should go out there. And Tom actually helped me set up the meeting. And I went out there, and HBO bought the second book as a possible property for a miniseries. They didn't want to do a continuing series, but they wanted to just reproduce the book. So suddenly, I was no longer a junior producer on somebody else's show. Suddenly, I was an executive producer for the first time on a show that, in theory, was going to get made by a premium cable network. And I said to myself, okay, I'll do that, and even if it gets picked up and gets made, it'll be just another year or two, and then I'll go back to journalism. So I off and running, and then the corner.
It's a 6-episode miniseries, and we're going to see a clip first, a couple of clips that are put together. I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful show, so I'd like us to stop a little bit. It's more than 5 minutes, but I think it's worth it.
All right, Chanel, come on, show us how to do it. All right. Oh, yeah, that's right. Hey. Socks only?
Socks only?
It's a sock hop, so take off your shoes and put them over there. All right.
Sorry, Miss Ellen. His feet be stinking. Sorry, so.
But the shoes do have to come on. Come on.
Hey, man, that's Janita's cousin.
She fine. Come on, which one you mean? Short and yellow? Just get inside. It's time to take your ass on another kind of trip. Cause you can't have the hop if you don't have the hip. Grab your back with the extra clip and close your eyes and hit the switch. We're going to a place where everybody kick it, kick it, kick it. Yeah, that's the ticket. Ain't no bloodin', ain't no gripping, ain't no punk ass nigga set tripping. Everybody got a stack and it ain't no crack. And it really don't matter if you're white or black. I wanna take you there like the Staples says. Put something in the
that's all right.
know that I can bring it if you can't take the heat. Get your ass out the kitchen. We on a mission.
Yo, you don't want to dance with him? Man, that's Dre girl. He my cousin. Plus he locked up in a home, fool. Oh, shit. He ain't my cousin.
I'm trying to find a place where I can live my life and maybe
Sorry, I'm just playing, nigga. I'm gonna dance with him.
And even if I get away from them drive-by killers, I still got to worry about those snitch-ass niggas. I keep on searching and I keep on looking, but niggas are the same from Watts to Brooklyn. I try to keep my faith in my people.
How long you think Dre gonna stay locked up?
You don't understand about running with a gang, cause you don't
I don't know, probably whole summer.
You don't have to stand on the corner and slang.
So, still with Dre, right?
So? That don't mean we can't dance.
You better make a layer.
How old is she? Tyrese? I think she turned 14. That girl is too bold for 14. She just having fun. Everybody, listen to me. I need you to wait up against this wall for 1 minute. Lisa, would you watch him for me?
Okay.
Gentlemen, excuse me. We're bringing the little ones from St. Martin's over to the rec center, and we're coming right past here, today and every Thursday following. So I would appreciate it if you could just take a moment when the little ones are coming through.
Oh, yeah, Miss Ellen.
Death row, death row, death row, death row. Yo, chill, man. Didn't you hear what she just said?
Hi, Blue.
Hey, Ella.
Today, maybe?
Hey, y'all. Peoples,
Come
chill
on,
out.
let's go.
Shorty's coming through.
Come on, babies, let's go.
Hope this makes everybody want to watch the corner, but
Like I said, a lighthearted romp. You all noticed Clark Peters, Reg Cathy from The Wire on the corner there. We had a casting rule, by the way. If you were a street guy in the corner, you had to be a cop in The Wire, and if you were a cop in The Wire, you had to be a street guy in the corner.
So-
I got that wrong.
for the first time we see the idea that's very important in your work of these forgotten territories and the sort of the underclass left to itself. and it's almost ethnographic, I would feel. Do you feel that way about the corner, or the way you show these people is just...
Well, I want to be really careful because I was trained as a journalist, and every now and then I do something journalistic still around the edges of stuff. Ethnographer is a word that constitutes social science and anthropology, and they're into quantifiable empirical data and experience. And it's basically like journalism, it's supposed to be true. And I'm very conscious that when I'm doing this, even though I was following what actually happened in 1993 when we were on the corner of Monroe and Fayette, and these are all real people, these are all their real names, and we're not deviating from what happened that year. As soon as you turn the camera on and hire actors and directors start making beautiful shots, you know, it's attenuated. You're not telling the perfect truth anymore. Not that journalism is the perfect truth, but it's at least more of an honest attempt. And so I always say, okay, this had its origins in journalism, but the book is journalism. The book, The Corner, is journalism, and this is docudrama. You know, that horrible word of docudrama. And in the case of The Wire, where we were just making up a story, it's drama. It's a drama. So, you know, you're wearing one hat or the other, and I think bad things happen when journalism gets its nose out of joint about what drama can achieve, and bad things happen when drama tries to pretend that it's journalism. So I try to be as clear as I can about that. And ethnography, you know, with its academic background, I'm really careful. So.
But it's not entertainment in the way that we, you know, it's a new thing, actually.
Well, I'm not trying.
When I watch this, I feel this is new.
I would feel, coming from journalism, that if I made a television show that was only entertaining, that you got through it and you thought, well, that was great, what's next? And it didn't leave you thinking about any of the thematic content or the political argument that might be underlying what you just saw, that I had failed. That I had, that my life was starting to be sort of a misspent misadventure at that point, and that, you know, getting out of journalism was truly the act of an apostate rather than maybe a little bit of a forced move or a lucky break or whatever you want to say. So.
And there's also a great ambition in the form. I mean, the movie making, the filmmaking isn't just, you know, random. It looks nothing like we've seen before on television. Did you have this in mind while making the show?
We did have this in mind. Bob Colesbury is the visual template here. At this time, I still know very little about filmmaking in terms of, I know an awful lot about story, and I even know what can work in terms of script work on camera and what can't. I've had 2.5 years of working on the Homicide show before I made this. We did set coverage, we did casting. Tom even allowed us in the editing room as we got more experience. You know, I learned a lot, but I still couldn't tell one lens from another. And there was a real sense of relying on those people. Nina Noble, who was a producer on this, and Bob Colesbury, who was a very experienced director-producer, that they created a visual template that could achieve what I was trying to do on the script. So film, more than any other medium, is collaborative. Television is extremely collaborative because you need continuity to go episodic, to keep running episodes and then seasons one after another. So I had delegated, and very comfortably, to people who knew the technical end of, you know, what it means to put film in the can. I would show up on set. Rock Dutton was the director. Bob was at his side. I would look at the dailies. I would make suggestions here and there without even having the vernacular of knowing what I was asking for. I would know when something's wrong. You know, it felt like this. I didn't feel this from this character. You know, this scene wasn't conveying, but how to fix it was I didn't even have the vocabulary to deal with that. So.
And I think The Corner goes very far into its subject, and there's one last clip of the show that I'd like us to see and discuss. When I saw this, I was just completely shocked.
I went to see this movie. The one about what they did to the Jews in the war. You went to see a movie?
Lord, what they did to them people.
What kind of dope fiend go to the goddamn movie?
The Germans decided that they weren't human no more. They just said, no, you ain't human like we human. And when they said that, hey, man, it just got easy for them to do all kinds of dirt. By the end, all the Germans could do, man, was like get rid of them, you know, kill them all. Because, you know, they couldn't see them being anything better than rats or bugs.
That sounds like a miserable ass movie.
Yeah, but it was real, all right? And I'm sitting there and I'm watching this movie. And I'm realizing that it's happening again.
How you mean, Gary?
Hey, man, we sitting here day after day making ourselves a little bit less human. And the world's happy to see it. It seems like they happy to see it, man. I mean, when I was making money, like, it didn't matter. Because I was still a nigga. And now that I'm sitting up here getting high with y'all, it's still the same.
You talk some crazy shit, Gary.
Don't you see what I'm saying? The Germans made the Jews and the niggas. That's what that was about. And that's what this is here. Except we doing it to ourselves. It seems like the world just can't wait for us to finish. Until we all end up dead.
Man, just shut up and shoot dope.
You know, the scene feels really hyperbolic, pulled out of the movie. But if you saw the whole episode, Gary, it was true. Gary, that was the summer of Schindler's List. And Gary, that summer, also had a job. He was working in a crab house in Baltimore, in the kitchen. And they were paying him in cash every day. And, you know, so he could maintain, he could get what he needed to get high. And he even had money to pass off to his mother. And then he had like a little bit of money that he actually didn't have to spend on dope or coke. And he kept saying he wanted to see Schindler's List. He'd heard about it. He'd heard somebody talking. And so we went downtown to, you know, the Academy 8, you know, the multiplex. And Gary sat through it with me. And he was very quiet. And I didn't hear about it from him for 2 days. And then he just kept talking about the film for weeks afterwards. He would talk about it in the shooting gallery. He would talk about it, you know. And so there's a scene earlier where he goes in to see the movie. As a point of sort of hilarity, I actually spent time trying to get on the phone with Steven Spielberg to get permission to use just a little piece of the clip so I could come around from behind Gary's head and show what he was watching. And I couldn't get permission. So we had to sort of shoot it this way.
Just with the mic. Sorry.
Yeah, just, right, and just
so
use the sound.
people can hear you. That's
I'm sorry, and we shot it with the sound. So you heard bad Germans yelling, you know, Raus, and, and you heard, like, you know, the sounds of people crying, and some vague approximation of the clearing of the ghetto, of the Polish ghetto in the movie. We tried to get it similar to the scene, but we had to cheat. It was probably the most problematic thing to try to keep that in the movie because we couldn't directly reference the film. But, you know, that was the summer of '93, and that's when that film came out in America. I guess in everywhere, actually.
You say it's hyperbolic, but it's still a very strong statement and something very, you know, I hadn't read this anywhere before. I mean, heard this kind of, you know,
it was from Gary.
It's touchy material.
It was from Gary. I mean, I wouldn't have made that equation. Gary saw that movie, and then he carried it back into his neighborhood. And it really was sort of startling. You know, the first rule of being a dope fiend is, you know, what you spend your money on is dope and coke. And but Gary, when he got that job, and it sort of provided him with a steady stream of income, he became sort of a citizen dope fiend. And, you know, the other thing he did on that same trip down to the theater was he went to the health food store, and he bought a bunch of vitamins, which was an astounding, you know, you're taking vitamins and shooting heroin. But Gary was a strange and wonderful person. That was Gary McCullough. You know, he was just a remarkable man. There's a lot of bubbles there's a lot of Gary McCullough that found its way into Bubbles.
Well, that's a good transition because the show that your last chance to be a journalist again went away when HBO bought a show called The Wire.
I betrayed myself and all my principles again. The Corner was finished. We went out to the Television Critics Association's, you know, the upfronts where you're sort of telling the critics what's coming out in Pasadena. I'm in the HBO hospitality room for the critics, and the head of series, Carolyn Strauss, comes up to me and says she'd watched some of The Wire, and I'm in The Corner, and it was really well done, and we'd come in under budget, and it looked really sharp. Did I have anything else? Is there any other ideas that I had? And the one part of The Corner book that we were unable to convey was a lot of that book, not a lot, but I mean most of the book is the story of the people in that neighborhood. You know, Gary McCullough, Fran Boyd, who was Candy Alexander, who was his one-time common-law wife, and then DeAndre, their son, who they were talking about, who was locked up earlier in the year, and then Ella, who ran the rec center that you saw, and Fat Kurt, Clark Peters. It was basically a microcosm of addiction and life in a drug-saturated neighborhood, sort of at a time of war. You know, when you were, they were being heavily policed by what felt like an army of occupation. The police would swoop in, gather people up, come back, do it again, do it again. It was just an attritive nightmare. But that's all. You couldn't like convey what had gone wrong with the drug war in macro terms because nobody was talking about that, and there wasn't a character that was even addressing it. You know, the cops did what they did, the people on the street did what they did, every day was the same. So you could look at people's lives and where the lives were going, and you could find the arc of what happened to those people in '93, but none of them were contemplating this as a political reality or as an economic reality or as a social reality. So those sections of the book that actually dealt with them, that were in the voice of the authors, they laid on the page. We had no place for them in the miniseries. So Ed and I, upon being given this invitation, we said to each other, maybe there's a way of addressing that. And that became The Wire, eventually. And that's what we offered to HBO when they said, do you have anything else? And so now I'm not going back to journalism for a little while longer. I don't know how long. I don't know how many seasons. I don't know if it's going to work. But hey, they're willing to pay us for some scripts, and they're willing to consider the idea. Ed, let's give this a shot. So
I found something that's supposedly the pitch that you wrote for the Bible for the show. There's this sentence that I'd like to read, and you maybe want to comment on it. But you say it's about season 1, and you say at the end of the 13 episodes, the reward for the viewer who has been lured all this way by a well-constructed police show is not the simple gratification of hearing handcuffs click. Instead, the conclusion is something that Euripides or O'Neill might recognize: an America at every level at war with itself.
Right. I'm going to have to answer that for that now, because you have to remember that's a memo that's being written to Chris Albrecht, the head of the network, to try to convince him to greenlight The Wire. And there's something funny in it, which is years before that, a couple years before that, Tom Fontana took us out to dinner down in Baltimore one day. We were working on Homicide, and he said, if you're ever pitching to Hollywood, and you want to intimidate them so that they think you know more than you do, mention Chaplin and Euripides. And obviously the first thing I thought of when I heard Euripides at the time was the Marx Brothers, Euripides pants, Eubiades pants. But what Tom said about that, he said, look, everybody loves Chaplin, so that will make them happy when they hear it. Nobody doesn't like Charlie Chaplin. Oh, Charlie Chaplin. And nobody's read Euripides, so they'll be scared. If they think if you've read Euripides, and right away you'll have them leaning back and on the defensive. So I couldn't resist but put Euripides in that memo, and of course I showed it to Tom later as a joke. So there's less meaning to that. And you got to remember, you say anything you can to try to get get the green light. So I was really stretching in that.
But still, the last sentence is basically what The Wire is about. America at every level at war with itself.
Well, eventually I was going to have to make something resembling what I pitched. So there's some things that I'm not ashamed of in there, but I recognize the purple, you know, in the prose.
But did you have, you know, now The Wire people just have universities study The Wire. Everybody thinks it's the great American novel of the 21st century. But when you started making it, did you have the the whole canvas in mind? Did you have this idea, you know, the big picture?
Well, we knew the first year was going to be about the drug war, and I knew I didn't have to tell them anything about the second year, and I didn't have to sit down and pitch that. I mean, at first I had to get up and running. And if I'd have gone into HBO and said, we're going to build a city slice by slice, and we're going to add the working class in season 2, and we're going to show the death of work, or we're going to add the political element in 3, and we're going to show the impossibility of reform, they'd have looked at me and said, are you fucking crazy? You know, I mean, like, you know, I mean, they all, actually, I turned in like a 60-page prospectus that had all the episodes beat out for season 1. All 13 of them, and you know, nobody turns that stuff. You know, shows get greenlit there on 2, 3, 4 pages of story Bible, sometimes, and so they, you know, Chris Albrecht got a thing this thick and looked at it and said, you know, he already was pretty convinced I was a little bit crazy. The idea that I was going to say, and this is season 1, and there'll be 5, you know, no, you know, get the show up. See if you can show them you can execute, and then go back. And so it was before season 2. Before season 2, I said, we're going to build a city. And I remember I was in the room with Chris and Carolyn Strauss, head of series, and I said, we're going to do this, then politics, then you know, we'll slice off public education. And I started saying this, and he looked at Carolyn and said, was that the plan? And Carolyn, who by this time had become a supporter of what we were doing, said, and I don't think I had pitched it to her before that moment, but Carolyn said, it is now. And that was as far as another, after that, the only meetings I had with them was to plead for us to be able to finish. Because of course, you know, very tellingly, we had no viewers for a long time.
When I said the word coherent earlier on, I mean that, you know, homicide was on the point of view of the cops, the institution. The corner was the other side, at least the show. This one is both sides, and that's sort of the revolution of The Wire, in my opinion, but, you know.
Yeah, I mean, those 2 books, Homicide, or Baltimore, as it's now called here, and The Corner, are sort of the basic research text, the texts for the world of The Wire. There were other worlds that we had to acquire in order to give it more breadth, you know, in terms of the port or the school system. But, you know, fortunately, we knew people who worked at the port, and they were willing to. One of them was willing to come on staff and work with us as a writer, and others were willing to consult with us. And Ed Burns, after his police career, taught school in the Baltimore City school system for 7 years. So, you know, we were able to acquire actual, you know, information about every fresh universe. But the 2 books that, you know, was a critique of the drug war and also an examination of the culture of violence, the first book, if you go back and read them, and I hope some of you will hang around and maybe buy a book or 2, or 3, you'll find a lot of stuff that ended up in The Wire and in The Corner, because it was true, and this was the world that was, and why not get it right? I mean, you can get it right just if you know it. You can get it right just as easily as getting it wrong. So, why not?
And before we get into the creative process of The Wire, we're going to see a clip from season 3, pretty famous clip.
That's far enough. Drop your laundry and turn slowly.
So you gonna rob me now? And to remind you who I am?
Omar, isn't it? Pull it slowly, then toss it.
Oh, I will move slow. I ain't tossing nothing. Bow tie. So whatever you're gonna do, you might as well go ahead and make it quick. I knew you'd come back.
I trust you didn't lose sleep over it.
Worrying about you be like wondering if the sun gonna come up. Ain't about to wild out over it. What I wanna know is how you find me.
Your boy, he didn't give you up easy.
Ain't no sugar water running through them veins. You kill him.
He's resting. I see you favor a 45.
Tonight I do. And I keeps one in the chamber in case you ponder it. Nice showpiece you got there.
Walther, PPK, 380, double action.
Here them Walters like to jump some.
As will you, with one in your elbow.
That gun ain't got enough firepower to make my joint useless. It definitely won't stop me from emptying out half my mag.
You might not hit me.
This range? And this caliber? Even if I miss, I can't miss.
I admire a man with confidence.
I don't see no sweat in your brow neither, bruh.
So it's basically a sex scene, in a way, but it's look at this back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like explaining that one. George Pelecanos, the writer of this episode, very famous crime writer in America, and here too, I understand, and one of the key voices in The Wire. He attended a course at the University of Maryland called The Western as a Cultural Art Form, film course, 6 credits. How do I know? Because I went to the University of Maryland, and I took the same course a couple years after him. We sort of wrote the same term paper on the same stuff, you know, a little slightly different subject. We all saw the same movies. They showed us John Ford, they showed us The Wild Bunch, they showed us Howard Hawks, you know, all the good Westerns. And so this was George and a favorite director of his having a lot of fun. Maybe a little too much fun, because when they turned in the first cut, it was even more of a spaghetti Western. It was amazing. Like, I was like, it had stopped being even in the realm of The Wire. And so I sort of fought them down to this. You know, I kept cutting pauses and close-ups, and you know, I kept trying to leach some of the more of the blood out of it. It was a battle between me and George. And you know, later on, George told me he thought it was actually, the editing was actually going to go deeper. So there was a silent negotiation between us. It was very funny. But yeah, this is homage to the American Western.
And the idea also for you making this writer's room, you know, the writer's room is what every show has a writer's room. Not every show has The Wire's writer's room, which was made, maybe you'll tell me, but writers, you know, George Pelecanos writes novels. You guys weren't that experienced with making a television show. That was the idea, I guess.
Well, I wanted to hire people who didn't make television. Because, you know, you hire a bunch of good television writers, you're going to get a good television show. And The Wire was a television show. I understand that I'm being a little bit fraudulent with that. But I wanted everyone to be thinking of the whole, not just of their episode. I wanted it not to be about the episodic. I wanted you to feel stronger at the end of the seasons than during the run. I wanted to build, you know, I wanted people to feel responsible for every thread of the story, even if it was an episode that you weren't assigned to or didn't work on. I wanted to create continuity in the writer's room so that we were all serving the story as a whole. And for that, who better than multi-POV novelists, you know, modern novelists who have to think that way just as a matter of course, as opposed to episodic television writers. So, yeah, first I went after George, and then armed with George, I had enough credibility, and George, of course, had enough standing that George could go ask Richard Price, who I knew, but I felt like if George is in, then Price isn't being asked to cross that threshold and become television hack. You know, Price is a noted literary figure. In my country and here too, I'm sure, and a great screenwriter. I mean, he's paid a lot of money to write movies. So here we come in with our little rinky-dink, you know, television episodic scale. We thought, you know, if it's about the money, we ain't going to get him. But George and I went down to a book signing that he had in Washington, D.C. George introduced him at a bookstore. And then we buttonholed him, with George taking the lead. And by the time we left Washington, he was in. So then it was like, go get Lehane. I guess if we'd gone another season, we could have gotten, I don't know, somebody really like dangerously literary, Philip Roth or something. Who knows, But it's like, people kept saying yes, much to our surprise, It was really
what kind of showrunner would you say you were? Hands-on all the time, or did you trust the other people?
You're responsible. Somebody is responsible for going to HBO and saying, this is how we executed, this is why we executed. You have to defend your use of a lot of money. The Wire was a very cheap show, but even so, in the average season, probably for all 5 seasons, you're spending $30 million. And that's not a lot by standards of 10 hours of TV in America for other more complicated shows. If you're building big sets or you're a period piece, you're going to be spending more money. But by standards of human endeavor, $30 million is a lot of money. And I felt responsible. So you're trying to hold everybody on a leash and make sure that we're all pushing for the same thing, but you don't want them to ever feel the tug of the leash. You want to make them feel like that they can be creative and that they can get their own stuff in and serve the whole. Sometimes you have to tug the leash and it's awkward because writers, I don't know if you know this, but writers tend to have ego. Just sort of a byproduct. I don't know where it comes from. But, so here I got a room full of really well-known novelists all trying to participate in a communal act of creativity, and yet they're incredibly competitive with each other, and they're passionate about what they do, and it's very delicate. And I learned an awful lot about human relations working that writer's room.
You had your own personal leash, and the HBO executives were holding it. They wanted to, cancel the series after 3 seasons, I think.
Sure, nobody was watching, which tends to be a requirement for television shows with most people. I remember the first 3 seasons were kind of easy. They gave it a long run, and they said, I remember when the 3rd season premiered, and for the first time they had us on in fall, which put us up against American football, which is kind of like being up against the Coliseum and the Lions and the Christians. It's real spectacle. You're not just fighting against the other TV shows. You're fighting against the first love of my country when it comes to entertainment. We got killed. Our numbers just dove. And, I remember we got bad numbers the first season. I remember this wonderful conversation I had with Carolyn Strauss where I called her and I said, that's not a very good number, right, for Sunday night? And she said, oh, it's a cute little number. And I always love her for that. I love her for that moment because I didn't worry about numbers for the first season. And then second season, the numbers actually went up because we had white people at the port. And so more Americans actually thought it was worth watching. And then third season, back to the inner city because that's the way the story was going, and football, and we got wiped out. So at the end of 3 seasons, HBO looked at it and they said, look, we got great reviews from critics all 3 seasons, and you just finished off the Barksdale story. Why don't we not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? Why don't we end it now? We're not firing. You go on, you make something else if you want. And we already had in our minds the 2 seasons that would culminate The Wire. And I set about writing memos and begging and wrapping my arms around the legs of HBO executives. And just, I couldn't bear the thought of not finishing the story. And to their great credit, not once but twice they let us talk our way out of the grave, and they let us finish the show. And that was, it was Chris and it was Carolyn, but it was also Richard Plepler and Mike Lombardo, but especially Plepler, who I didn't know, but behind the scenes he was telling Chris, this show is why HBO, this is why we have HBO, this is why we're different, this is our brand. I don't know if people are going to find it. I don't know if, but you got to let them finish. And Chris did. And the joke is, when viewers started showing up, we were a year, 2 years, 3 years off the air. They were finding it on DVD and through word of mouth. So that was a new dynamic for television.
Yeah. We'll watch another clip from season 4, which is a great season about the public system. It's about these kids who they're in a special class, and they have a reward because they did well. And the reward is going to a fancy restaurant.
Coven, party of 4.
I'll make sure your table's ready.
Coven party of 4, huh?
Hi, may I take your coat?
Sure.
You, sir?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Yeah, me too.
Your table's ready. Follow me, please. Sir?
That's your chair, right?
No. Yes, it did.
The waitress will be here soon to detail the specials of the day. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Waitress? Who was that?
That's the hostess.
Hey, you ain't got to worry, Mrs. C. I ain't gonna run up your bill. I'll just get whatever's on special.
It ain't no Kmart blue light special, dumbass. Special just mean they cook something different.
Well, what about you? Drinking without a straw, ghetto and shit.
You don't drink water with a straw. And put that on your lap, fool. You see anybody else up in here looking all Fred Flintstone and shit?
Shh. Oh, shut it down. Other people be looking at us.
Hello, my name is Pam. I'd like to tell you about our specials for the day. We have king salmon with sweet corn, chanterelles, and basil aioli, sauteed free-range chicken served with mashed potatoes, fresh Chesapeake Bay blue crab, roasted garlic, shallot cream, and hen of the woods mushrooms, and wood oven roasted quail with grilled cipolline bread salad.
Dang, I thought y'all had steak.
Oh, we do, on the second page of your menus.
So that's politics.
Yeah, that's a very political scene, where it's about class and the divisions in my country between one America and the other. I experienced a number of meals like that when I was reporting The Corner and in the years afterwards with the kids from the neighborhood at moments when they would journey from one America to the other, which often was only a matter of blocks. You would see the vulnerability of the kids and how disconnected those two worlds were by anything other than some simple geography.
And how did you walk the thin line between making a statement and still writing by like a better world entertainment or art or creating art? But there's a
well, easy with that art stuff, but well, listen, at times it's always delicate. Sometimes you can, if you say too much about your intentions, it can become didactic. If you say too little, if you leave too little cue there for the viewer, sometimes, it can be just a scene about some people going to dinner and not having a good time. Everything matters. One thing about film is every line of dialogue, every gesture, everything you put into the finished movie has to justify itself. It's either there for a reason or it's not. And that's true in terms of keeping the viewer's attention and not, I'm accused of moving very slowly, much slower than most television does. And that's true because I'm sort of chasing something a little bit different than, a lot of television entertainment is extremely fast-paced and extremely literal. And they're trying to have sort of a ticking time bomb feel. They're going for action. They're going for adventure, things that are entirely worthy if that's what you're seeking. I'm not good at it, but more than that, I'm not particularly interested in it. But I am interested in sort of how my city works or doesn't work. And for that, I have to take a certain amount of time. But even within that framework, I have to decide when to get in, when to get out of a scene, how much to show, is it too much? And you can make mistakes. You know, nothing's perfect, and The Wire is certainly not perfect, or anything. You know, there's a certain pain, by the way, to sitting here and having somebody pick scenes from something you worked on years and years and years ago. You see things that you would do differently all the time. You know, I felt that same way when I looked at some of the English translation of the book. I'm very proud of the book. The book is, I think, a really good depiction of the culture of violence in my country and police work, but it was written by, you know, a 28, 29-year-old. And he was good at the time. Hopefully he got a little better, or shame on me. But you're walking a fence. You're on top of a fence. You could fall over in either direction at any moment.
And what do you expect from the viewer watching your shows? And that's, you know, not a rhetorical question. It's you've said that The Wire has to be watched a few times. That, you know, you don't. Do you believe in the idea of an episode, or do you feel that nobody can get?
I don't know that I said that it had to be watched a few times. I don't think I've ever said that. I have said, you know, that I'm not sure anyone can give a really effective judgment on how well we executed or how we didn't execute it until they've seen the end. Stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I believe that. And, you know, in the same way, it's important for us to end a show, to end it, so it has an ending, so it maximizes the experience of watching it as a completed story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And television is not built that way in my country. Television is built so that you write to appease the viewer, so you get the maximum number of eyeballs, so you have a hit, because then you have a franchise that you can sustain. And there's so much money in the entertainment industry that the idea of getting a show up and not wanting to run it out to the ends of the earth until you can't sustain it anymore is almost inconceivable to some people and to some networks. So there's a lot of, we've all seen shows that had maybe 2, 3, 4 seasons in them, which is a lot of story, and that's what they had. And then after that, they were spinning wheels. They were basically recasting themselves again and again. You know, and if people want them some more Stringer, give them more Stringer. If they love them some Omar, give them more Omar. That's not storytelling to any purpose. That's I don't know what that is. That's soap opera. That's franchise. That's a franchise. So all of this sort of enters in the equation. But I do believe you could watch The Wire once, but I do believe probably because we weren't leaving as many obvious visual cues as television normally does to what we were trying to say, you'll get more out of it if you're not doing the laundry or getting up to go get a sandwich, or, you know, you miss a scene or two, the scene's probably going to matter. It's probably in there for a reason. And that's not necessarily the case with a lot of television entertainment.
So how did you react to the cult status? Because cult came afterwards, and the idea of a cult TV show, we think of Lost or Cheers, or, you know, and
no, those were hits.
Do you think, yeah.
Those were hits. Cult is cult. Hit is hit. I haven't had a hit. I would.
So you don't feel
it would be interesting to know what one felt like. I reacted by saying, "That's good," because if we didn't have cult status, we had no status. You know, you're not writing so that nobody can watch you. It's not like that great line from Spinal Tap. You know, our audience isn't becoming smaller; it's just becoming more selective. You know, we wanted an audience, and we were disappointed that we were unable to achieve it doing what we were doing, but nor did we want to do something that we didn't want to do. We were willing to go down in flames. It would have hurt, we would have felt bad, but you know, it would have felt unfinished. It would have felt like we'd missed our chance to tell the story we wanted to tell, but we weren't willing to tell a story somebody else wanted, or to tart it up, or you know, in order to get it to stay on the air. So it was kind of a game of chicken, and we were we had to wait and see if we had enough goodwill at the network, and if people would start to find it. I mean, the thing that kept it alive for 5 years was goodwill at the network, and the critics kept saying, Nobody's watching it, but it's great. The critics came behind the show and stayed behind the show. And so that was at least in the ear of the HBO execs.
And right after, actually, you were already pitching your next show, which was a miniseries called Generation Kill after The Wire. We won't have time to show a clip from it, but it's
a shame.
It's from.
That's the one that I'm really proud of.
Oh, really? Oh, we should have spent half an hour on that then. I'm sorry. But it's from actually a piece of journalism as well. You didn't write it, but it was from a Rolling Stone guy.
A Rolling Stone reporter named Evan Wright was embedded with the 1st Recon Marines on the way into Baghdad. And he wrote a marvelous book of war reportage, probably, I think, one of the best to come out of the Iraq conflict. And it's a very honest work. And the Marines, it's the real names of the Marines. It's what really happened on the way into Baghdad. And I think it was a very vulnerable piece because America, had just gone through a lot of the Fallujah and a lot of the places where the constant bombing, the constant IEDs, Humvees being blown up, casualty rates were high, and America had sort of opted out of. There was a war exhaustion that had taken hold in the country, so that nobody really wanted to face the TV screen and witness a drama. And I sort of knew that going in, but I didn't care. The journalism was great. I felt a real fealty to his book in the same way that we didn't take a lot of liberties with the corner because that was real people, and I felt the same way about. And so did Ed Burns, and Evan wrote the scripts with us. So we had him in the room, so not just as a bullshit meter, but as somebody who was creatively making sure we got the real voices of these Marines and that we were precise about what really happened. And I think it's one of the best executed pieces I've ever been involved with. I was really proud of it when it came out. But yeah, once again, nobody, watched it, except Marines. By the way, if you go to Camp Pendleton or Camp Lejeune, and you ask Marines, they'll tell you, I said, what's true to your world? What's true to modern warfare? And they'll say Generation Kill and the first 30 minutes of Full Metal Jacket. That's it. So
that's something to be proud of.
Yeah, they don't like the last part of Metal. They like the drill sergeant, like everybody. That's the part they like.
And what were the political reactions? Were there any, or did you feel like?
Yeah, liberals watched the show and they were mad that the Marines were giving it. You got to remember who Marines are. It's a volunteer army. They're gunslingers. They're warriors. It's what they're waiting for a war to happen because that's what they train for. That's what they believe their role in society is. It's not their job to have discretion over what is just or what is appropriate or what is a war of choice or what is a war of necessity. Those decisions are not in their pay grade. What is in their pay grade is to be incredibly effective at achieving mission, and mission is kill the enemy. So that said, these were 22, 23, 24-year-old men who actually, in the long run, many of them demonstrated, a more conscientious sense of morality in very problematic circumstances than I think I could have mastered. When I was 22, it was an open question as to whether I could properly make a bed. And some of these guys were making the decision on whether to call in an airstrike or not as lance corporals. And that's, Recon Marines are trained to operate in small units, so there is no officer often. In fact, part of the conflict in the movie is they're given officers because they're operating as a full battalion. And so their officers are around, and the officers actually are less effective than the operators, than the enlisted men. So there's all this tension about what are we doing, why are we doing it, what's a civilian, what's not a civilian, what are the rules of engagement. They're actually thinking about these things as moral questions. So the longer you continue to watch it, and then finally they get to Baghdad and it becomes utterly apparent that while they conquered the country in rather brilliant strategic fashion, what to do with the country was an open question once they got to Baghdad. And they perceive that question very quickly, that there is no answer that they're being given. So the piece actually had some political sophistication, but I think a lot of Americans, they saw, if they were for the war, they saw that the Marines were sarcastic and very profane and not John Wayne, and they didn't like that. And if they were against the war, nobody was stepping in to say, hey, that's not right to talk that way. Why, they weren't validating the people who were against the war. To which I say, you know, a plague on both your houses. You know, pay attention. This is a story about young men at war who are actually at war. And so, yeah, that one went, you know, again, I mean, I couldn't find an audience to save my life. But now, last year, we sold more DVDs of Generation Kill than came out in 08, sold more DVDs in 2011, you know, than the year before, than the word of mouth again. So, you know, not a big hit, but among people who know people who are in the American military, it's become a little bit iconic.
So your shows are basically successes after they get off the air. That's what
success is a big word. I mean, the more honest thing to say is, I keep writing shows, and I keep becoming involved in shows, and the people who work with me, you know, one of the directors of Generation Kill, who did some episodes of Treme, he said, well, the last thing I did for you, we basically wrote it for 26 recon Marines in platoon, in Bravo platoon. You know, that's who you were writing for, to get a story that you wouldn't be ashamed for them to watch it. And now you've got a script that, you know, at least 300, 400 musicians in New Orleans are going to know is authentic. So by that standard, you've become a populist. You know, this is positively commercial for you. You know, and I had to laugh because you know, on some level he's right.
You just mentioned Treme. The last clip we're going to see tonight is the opening credits of the show. Can we put the music up a little bit, please? The thing about Treme, so it's post-Katrina New Orleans, and the first time I watched it, I was like, okay, maybe that's a more optimistic show than The Wire or all the others. Then I saw all the funerals and everything, and I just, you know, I changed my mind a little bit. But would you say it's a little more optimistic and, you know?
I think the subject matter is less dark. You're not with kids on a corner selling drugs with guns. You're not with Marines about to go to war. It's a show about culture and what culture means to the American city and to society, I guess, by implication in general. I was shocked after The Wire and after The Corner. There was a lot of discussion about, a lot of people commented very cynically and said, man, Baltimore's fucked up. Why don't they leave? You know, why would anyone stay there? Why, you know, obviously the city is irredeemable. And I never thought that in my life in making it. And I was sort of shocked that somebody would perceive something that you know, that a message could even be constituted as such. And the more I sort of read about people's reaction to what they thought we were saying, the more they thought, some people mistook The Corner, and I can't believe you did if you watched all of it, but I could see you catching some of it and being misinformed and thinking it's somehow a little bit misanthropic. It's basically saying that the people are all flawed and venal and corrupt. corrupt was a word that often got misused in The Wire. I thought a lot of people were, it was less about corruption in the sense of venality as it was about agendas that were no longer connected to utilitarian benefit. They were these self-preserving institutions, self-aggrandizing institutions, people guiding themselves so that they avoid political pain and achieve political pleasure. It was like a big Skinner box. It was all behavioral science. So corruption was like, if we can only find the right villain and get rid of him, and that was what The Wire really wasn't about. So I listened to that about the American city, and I thought, there's something going on there. Americans, all of us, the world, Paris. I was at a bookstore in a part of Paris that it was explained to me that this was the suburb, it was a faubourg of Paris, and now the city had grown around it. Now Paris was 6.5 million, so it's now in the middle of the city. I just read a book by Steve Inskeep about Karachi, a city that was 400,000 in Pakistan right after World War II and is now something like 30 million. Homo sapiens is now an urban creature, now and forever. The pastoral, the sense of the rural, all of that, it's a nice nostalgic sensibility, and I hope we keep some parks and some places to hike, because we need them, but we're going to be increasingly urban. We're going to be increasingly compacted in urban space. We're going to be increasingly multicultural. Migration has become, the world's gotten a lot smaller. More and more of us are from somewhere else. The sounds coming down the hall are not the music of our culture, but somebody else's. The smells coming from somebody else's dinner are very different. And how we respond to that and what we achieve with that dynamic is sort of the question for the 21st century. And so the idea that we would make all these pieces that we thought were about what's gone wrong in the American city, and people would sort of sneer at it a little bit and say, well, what's gone wrong is, people are bad, or Simon thinks that people are irredeemable, or it's misanthropic, was startling to me. So watching New Orleans after this near-death experience of Katrina, when 85% of the city went underwater, and watching and taking, going there and doing the reporting and taking notes on what happened and what worked, something was remarkable in my mind, which was the city has all the problems of Baltimore, and in some ways worse. It's one of the more corrupt, truly corrupt governments, civic governments. The police department is actually under court order by a federal court in my country now because of the number of acts of violence against its own citizens. During the storm and even before the storm, the police department is dysfunctional. The city school system, by test score, is one of the worst in the country. The infrastructure is almost hilariously bad. Not just the flood control, but near where I live in New Orleans, we had a pothole that was so deep it could swallow a car axle, and it was in the middle of a main intersection, and it stayed there for about 5 months. And then on Mardi Gras, during the celebration, the neighbors came out. The only thing the city did was they put like one of those cones in the middle of it, a barrel, orange and white. And the neighbors on Mardi Gras, they came out and they decorated it with beads and made it like a Mardi Gras. They made it pretty, which, again, the spirit of New Orleans. It's a beautiful thing. But what did work in New Orleans was an incredible sense of culture, an incredible sense of this is the only place on earth that is like this. And indeed, it's the American city that gave the world the American gift that is certain to be our cultural legacy. If we, with the possible exception of blue jeans, of Levi's, African American music is the great American gift that's gone around the world. Wherever you are, whatever bar you walk into, whatever tavern, whatever shebeen, whatever brasserie, if they've got a jukebox or if they've got a stereo system, you will hear African American music. You'll hear blues or jazz or R&B or hip hop. It's gone everywhere. And it shows no signs of abating. It's taken over world culture. And that happened in 8 square blocks of New Orleans. And it's still happening. It's still a vibrant, the music scene is not a museum there. It changes every day. And that was the only thing they had that worked, was their assertion for culture. It was the only thing that gave them a sense of purpose and community that they could trust. And it's been very effective, and it's been about the only effective thing, and the city is maybe 60, 70% back now, and still struggling, and still with all the attendant problems. But that said to me something about the American city, because without the city life, without the melting pot that my country is part of our myth, American myth, without European arrangement and instrumentation, and without West African rhythm and West African flatted third and seventh notes in the pentatonic scale, and without the Spanish tinge in the music that came from Cuba and Haiti, all that doesn't happen 100 years ago, and it doesn't metastasize wonderfully. Probably metastasize is the wrong word. It doesn't morph, it doesn't mutate into all these various musical forms that have become a defining cultural statement. So there was an argument for the city, and that's what I think you may be sensing. That's what you may be sensing in Treme, is that it is an overt argument for urbanity and for everything that urbanity represents as being a necessary human future.
Well, I have many more questions, but I would like 2 questions from the audience because we have to wrap this very quickly. Si vous avez des questions à poser à David Simon, on va pas avoir le temps d'en prendre beaucoup, mais allez-y, profitez-en.
Je peux la poser en français?
Ouais.
Oui. Je voulais savoir quand...
I'd like to know, between the corner and the wire, and then from Generation Kill and to Treme, you changed terrains there to a subject you didn't know. You changed to New Orleans. How did you maintain the authenticity? You went from something that you knew, which was Baltimore, from the corner and the wire, and you moved into New Orleans, something you didn't know. So how?
Again, film is the most communal, creative narrative form there is. 120, 140 people go into making the average television production. And the writer's office alone contained 3 or 4 people every year from New Orleans who were natives of the city or who had grown up there, who understood the culture. We hired consultants. It wasn't like you hired one jazz consultant. It was modern jazz consultant, trad jazz consultant, Cajun music consultant, hip-hop, New Orleans hip-hop, not just general hip-hop. And put them all on retainer and brought them all in. We need to know about the school system, bring the Times-Picayune reporter in, ask all your, we did reporting, and we gathered as much information as we could. My co-creator of the show, Eric Overmyer, has, for 20 years, had a house and lived half the time in New York, half the time in New Orleans. I'd been going out of New Orleans from my late 20s. It was a sort of a default destination for me in my country. I was on a reporter's salary. All the European vacations I couldn't afford, I would go to New Orleans and pretend. So there was a reservoir of knowledge, but then you're right in that it wasn't all immediate. It was harder. It wasn't all at our fingertips. It wasn't all in our head. So we paid a lot of people to help us and to contribute, and it's the work of many people. And I should say that right now. You bring up something that I always want to say is, it's all David Simon's Treme. I've gotten sort of noted for being the lumpy white guy on the prow of the ship, But again, you watched a lot of writing that wasn't David Simon, and you watched a lot of filmmaking that wasn't David Simon. It really is communal, and it's the collective institutional memory and intelligence that matters. So, just like Generation Kill, Ed and I would have never tried to write that without the guy who was actually in the lead Humvee with that platoon in the room with us writing.
Yes, I'm intrigued by the actors that have appeared over and over in many of the series. I mean, I didn't know The Corner, but already in The Wire, and then to see them in so many other films now, so even if it wasn't a hit, it certainly must have done well by the actors, because now they seem to be all over the place.
I've gotten to work with a lot of great actors, and we've gotten to do a lot of good work together. and there's a little sort of Band of Brothers feeling, as if we are almost a repertory company, but we're not. And at some point, either the project won't fit somebody demographically, or the role isn't right, and you have to say, if you're doing your job, no, God knows I love working with you, but this is not right, or this isn't working. Or at other times, somebody comes in and reads, and you haven't worked with them before, but man, they're great, and you got to take that actor. So, it's no great sin to keep working with the same person if you're getting good work and it's the right work, but it's no great sin to move on when you have to move on. So, sometimes it's better to get out of your comfort zone in some ways and work with somebody fresh for a role. But I have to say, I've now done 3 things with Wendell and
Wendell Pierce.
Wendell Pierce and Clark Peters, who you saw him in the corner there, and they're in the, and I think at this point it doesn't matter what I do anymore. If it's a biopic on Benito Mussolini, or a piece about ballet, or a restoration comedy from Ireland or England, if I don't call Wendell, I think he's going to hunt me down.
Just one last for and we'll call it a night.
Bonsoir. Hello.
Salut.
Alors, bonsoir. J'adore Trémé.
I love Trémé. I wish it would keep going. Do you have other projects?
I don't know. I mean, at some point, HBO may figure out that nobody's watching what I do. And you have to admit, of all the people who've never gained an audience, I have the longest and most viable career of anybody. I've lasted 12, 13 years on their payroll, as a vendor, as somebody making TV for them. And every year they keep renewing it, and every year I'm all the more amazed. The Wire has given it, the long tail of The Wire, and the fact that it has built over time has given them, I'm sure, a lot of pause before they think maybe they should give up on me. But at some point, I always keep one suitcase packed. And there is stuff, it's almost not worth telling you what has been sort of what sits on a table waiting for consideration, because there's several, and none of them may go. Until you get a green light, it's almost not worth talking about. But I know this. I feel now that I've sort of wasted a life. It's getting less and less probable that I'm going to go back to journalism. But I might, and I'm okay with it if it happens. And sort of the trick is being okay with it when it happens. David Mills, who was another writer I worked with, he was on my college paper. And we worked on our college paper together, and we were going into journal. He went to the Washington Post, and I went to the Baltimore Sun. And he was an African-American writer. And we wrote our first episode of TV together. And like I said, the first time was a joke. I thought, well, this is fun. And the reason I called David up was when we were putting out the college paper late at night at the big state college where we were, it was the early 80s, and he would stop in the middle of putting out his pages, because he was the editorial page editor and the features editor at the same time. He would stop in the middle of his pages to go to the TV at 10 o'clock so he could watch Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere. He loved TV. He thought TV was actually real storytelling, and I didn't. And so when I had this opportunity to write an episode of Homicide off of my book, I called him because I thought, well, he's seen a lot more TV than I have, and he actually likes this. And so we wrote that first script together, and it was a Homicide episode that Robin Williams was in, and it won a writing award. And he went straight to Hollywood and got a job, and he was on NYPD Blue, and he was on Picket Fence. He was on a lot of shows, LA Law. And he said, "You're crazy. What are you staying at a newspaper for?" And I said, "I'm not crazy. You're crazy. What are you doing out there?" I mean, we didn't understand each other for a long while. When I ended up in TV, he would watch stuff like The Wire he did the corner with me, but then he went off and was trying to do network TV, and I was working on The Wire. And he watched the first few episodes, and he said, "You really don't care if this gets canceled." He said, your cast is 3/5 African American. That's a demographic problem right there. It is in America. I mean, you're not explaining everything. Your jargon and your cop speak and your street speak is really thick. He said it's kind of, it's real, like you're out there, man. And the thing that he said that I've always sort of taken with a point of pride is he goes, after a while he figured it out. He said, everybody in this town, and he meant L.A., Hollywood, it's like a plate on the end of, it's like somebody's spinning a plate on a stick, and they're trying to keep the plate up there. And if at any point it falls off and crashes, it's the end, and they're like standing on top of the plate, and they're balanced, and all they want to do is, it's like, what do they want this year? Are they doing cop shows this year? I got a cop show. Are they doing hospital shows? I got a hospital show. Is it Desperate Housewives? I got a bunch of sexy housewives. What do you want? What do you want? I'll give it to you. That's the demeanor of most people in the entertainment industry. And he said, everybody's trying not to fall off the spinning plate, and you just don't give a damn. And I took it with a particular point of pride because I realized I always expected to fall off the plate. And it was in that lack of expectation that I went the way I did, and I got as lucky as I did. And he's right. It was easier for me. I was at HBO. They were more experimental. He was trying to get TV made. He went through a series of deals where he wrote pilot after pilot after pilot for NBC and CBS and ABC, and he got paid really well. Everyone loved every pilot he gave them. That's the other thing in LA. They all love everything. It's all great. Oh, it's great, it's great, it's great. Can you get Jimmy Smits? No, you can't. Oh, we can't do it, sorry. There's so many reasons why stuff doesn't get made. But he dutifully tried to sort of scale that cliff. And he watched what happened to me, and he said, I think if you'd cared a little more about succeeding, you wouldn't have succeeded. Now, that's not a recipe for anything but absurdity, but, David passed away while we were working on Treme. He died of an aneurysm, very young. It's very sad. But I always remember that encounter with him because I don't think I take what he said with, it's one of my closest friends, and he said it sort of very affectionately, and I remember it very affectionately, and it's really true. So, at any moment I expect it to end.
Thank you. We have to wrap this. I'm sorry. Well, okay, go ahead, but we have to wrap.
You are the equivalent to Woody Allen in television. French love your movies, so you're okay.
At some point I have to I will end with this. I've had 5 days of talking about myself to the point where I'm even sick of talking about myself. And now I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back, after tonight. Tomorrow I go on a plane back home. And I don't know if you know this, I've gotten so much attention here and other places for The Wire, and it's very gratifying. I don't mean to be like anything other than gratified, but I have to be honest. When there's a historical note that when Roman generals would win a big battle, and they would come back to the Colosseum, come back to Rome, and they would come into the Colosseum, and their captives would be in front of them, and all of the triumphs that they had won, and all of the booty that they had collected, and then the legion would march behind them. They used to put a servant walking right behind the general, telling him in his ear, "You're not a god, you're not a god," so that while everybody was cheering and telling him there was somebody telling him, "Get over yourself." Well, I'm going home, and hopefully my wife is there, and she's going to say to me, "You're still an asshole."
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you.